So hello everyone, good morning, good day. For me, it's from Berlin, so it's a bright sunny afternoon. Very happy to be here. For those who don't know me, I'm Lily Fu. I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, a German political foundation that's affiliated with the German Green Party. I'm based in Berlin and heading our International Environmental Policy Division. I'm also a board member of the ETC, etc. group that is very much involved on the issues that we'll be discussing during this webinar. So that's why I mentioned that as well. And I'm very happy to make a few introductory remarks for this webinar that is jointly organized and hosted by 4 organizations, by the Center for International Environmental Law. And thank you, Marie, for assisting us with the logistics of this webinar. Oil Change International, the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and my own organization, the Heinrich Böll Foundation. So all of these organizations have recently launched major new reports that put together tell one coherent story. And that is basically the story that we want to share and dive into during this webinar. So the story is the following. As we all know, the IPCC, in its special report on 1.5 degree warming, has confirmed that it's very urgent to keep global warming below 1.5 degree, that's a very important threshold, basically 1.5 degree being the new 2 degrees. And that this means a rapid transition away from fossil fuels as the surest and basically only pathway to achieve this goal. And they also confirmed once again that the time window for any meaningful action is shrinking rapidly. So that's our starting point. But then recent research demonstrates that any continued development of new fossil fuels and an ongoing push for fossil fuel will push us beyond that limit. And we see, despite these warnings from the IPCC and other sources, we see new major investments in oil and gas, with the US as a major focus for some of that. At the same time, in the last couple of months, we've gained a much better understanding that we can and that we must limit global warming to 1.5 degree without reliance on dangerous geoengineering technologies. And we also know much better what that entails in terms of radical emission reductions, expansion of renewable energy and other alternatives, and protection and restoration of ecosystems. But the urgency of the climate crisis and the inadequate action that we're seeing from governments so far are spurring many serious and also well-informed observers, including from civil society, to seriously consider geoengineering technologies that were until recently unthinkable. So geoengineering as a concept and geoengineering technologies have recently gained an increasingly prominent role in climate policy debates. For example, many of the national determined contributions that countries have put forward under the Paris Agreement and framework rely heavily on future deployment of carbon dioxide removal. And we see a growing number of proponents, including from civil society, advocating for deployment or testing of so-called solar radiation management. So that's something that we want to address in this seminar. And before we start, there are 4 quick things that I want to clarify so there is no misunderstanding. The first one is what we mean by geoengineering. So when we say geoengineering, at least from our point of view at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and we're doing quite a bit of work on this, we're talking about large-scale, intentional technological interventions in our climate system. And the notion of geoengineering then includes a wide array of technologies centered out around reflecting sunlight back into space, so-called solar radiation management, or removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so-called carbon dioxide removal. This differentiation between these 2 types of approaches makes a lot of sense, but the technologies also have a lot in common across these categories. They all seek to intervene and alter Earth systems on a large scale. They're a techno-fix to climate change. And the technologies proposed all come with very far-reaching and profound social, political, environmental risks and impacts, some of them also geopolitical risks. And the effects would, by nature of the type of intervention, be transboundary, as well as large-scale and potentially unpredictable and irreversible. The second thing I want to clarify is, although we urgently need more and better governance of geoengineering, and there's a lot of discussion on that topic of governance, the debate around geoengineering does not take place in a legal vacuum as we speak. There is existing governance in place, including at the Convention on Biological Diversity of the UN that has agreed already back in 2010 on a de facto moratorium on all geoengineering technologies. There's also regulation and also ban of some approaches to marine geoengineering under the London Protocol to the London Convention. So we're not in a legal vacuum, but we need more and better governance. Third point I want to clarify is, although we are speaking about mostly fictional future theoretical technology, some of them might sound like sci-fi, some of you, there's a lot happening in the real world in terms of research, public support, testing, and commercial development of geoengineering. And one of the resources that we've put forward together with the ETC group is an interactive world map of geoengineering projects and research, and also experiments, if you want to have a look at that. And a fourth point, last one, is that the fact that there is a small but very active community out there that engages proactively on geoengineering and tends to have a rather open attitude to at least testing and developing these technologies, does not mean that that's the viewpoint of everyone. There's actually, in our view, a silent majority of civil society and social movements that is very strongly opposed to the idea of geoengineering. And together with those actors, almost 200 groups, we have a few months ago launched the Hands of Mother Earth Manifesto as a stop to ban geoengineering. It's a very strong call and also out there for you to check out if you like and if you want more information. So those are just 4 points I wanted to clarify before we get into the debate. Happy to also answer any of those questions later, but for now, I would pass it on to Alex Dukas from Oil Change International. We'll go next. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lily. I'm Alex Dukas with Oil Change International. I lead our Stop Funding Fossils program, our program on the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and public finance and all kinds of government support for fossil fuels. And our organization works, we're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C., with folks around the world, and we're really focused on exposing the true costs of fossil fuels and accelerating the transition to clean energy. And what I'm going to be talking about today, let me just pull up my slides, is, I'm just going to make sure this works, sorry. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is why addressing fossil fuel supply is critical for climate action, and why one approach to trying to reduce the emissions intensity of new oil production doesn't change that fact, and that's called carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. It's something that I think Carol's likely to touch on as well, given CIEL's new report on this issue. But first, I wanted to start by sort of situating the conversation around fossil fuel supply in the context of global carbon budgets. And based on a piece of analysis that we produced in 2016 called The Sky's Limit, if we're serious about the Paris Agreement's goals to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and aiming for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, we can't expand fossil fuel production. So how did we come to that conclusion? Because a lot of what I'm about to talk about sort of flows from that. As I mentioned, we did the analysis in this report called The Sky's Limit. Here's the key graph from the key figure from that report. And what it tells us is that we've already got too much fossil fuel production built to sort of stay within the Paris limits. So the takeaway from that is that it doesn't make sense to further expand fossil fuel production. And what we did with this analysis is we took data on already developed reserves of fossil fuels using data that's available from the IEA and the World Energy Council on coal, existing coal mining, and then also data from a consultancy called Rystad Energy, which is a data provider that's relied on by many actors in the oil industry, as well as industry analysts. It's a proprietary data source that we have a subscription to. And so what we wanted to do was just look at only those reserves of oil, gas, and coal that are already developed. That means they're already producing or they're under construction and there's steel in the ground, and see how that's stacked up against different carbon budgets. So looking at remaining below a 1.5 degree threshold, the warming threshold, to have a 50% chance of doing that, which isn't a great chance, in my opinion. I think we should be striving to do better than that. Is oil and gas alone, added to really, really conservative assumptions on cement and land use. It's going to take us beyond that 1.5 degree threshold. And again, these are already developed reserves. These are reserves that are already producing or under construction. And then oil, gas, and coal added together pretty much below a 2/3 chance of staying below 2. And just recall that the Paris Agreement language is that it's an absolute limit that the world has set for itself, that we need to stay well below 2 degrees. And I think the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees laid out pretty clearly what the difference is between a 1.5 degree warming world and a 2 degree warming world. And it's a pretty significant difference. So trying to take that a little bit into away from the global scale and into the US scale, I wanted to also touch on another piece of work that we just published earlier this year. And these pieces of work that I'm talking about at the front end of the presentation are by my colleagues, Greg Muddett and Kelly Trout, respectively. So just want to make sure folks know that I am not the primary author of these two pieces of really good work. But this report that we released, called Drilling Towards Disaster, looked specifically at this question of carbon budgets and proposed production of new oil and gas in the US, and found that if the US oil and gas boom that's currently underway continues unchecked, it could be game over for climate action. So just move on there. So this is a figure from that report, and basically what it shows is the carbon dioxide emissions from projected total production of oil and gas from some key new oil and gas production from key basins in the United States, and adding them all up, it's over 100 gigatons of emissions between now and 2050. The Permian Basin, and I'll put that in a little bit of context, so it's not just sort of an abstract number in a second, but centered around the Permian Basin for primarily oil production, and the Appalachian Basin, which is more centered on gas production. And just to give you some global context about what that would mean, what that would look like, in the Permian's peak year in 2029, so the Permian Basin spans Texas and New Mexico, it would mean that if the Permian were a country, it would be the second largest oil producer in the world under sort of business as usual scenario by 2029, just a hair off of Saudi Arabia. So it just gives you a sense of the amount of infrastructure development that's happening there and the oil industry's plans for expansion. And I want to just put that in the emissions that I mentioned earlier in context. So looking at the emissions unlocked by new US oil and gas production through 2050, just that additional increment, we're talking about emissions equivalent to the lifetime CO2 from almost 1,000 coal plants. So you can imagine that, you know, the impact on global carbon budgets is not great, especially from an equity perspective. And that's what this next slide is about. Just showing what are the implications for, you know, the global shares of supply if the US fossil fuel expansion continues unchecked. The black line at the top of this graph illustrates a 1.5 degree compatible pathway of oil and gas supply. And as you can see, if the US expansion continues unchecked and the rest of the world is actually trying to meet a 1.5 degree compatible pathway, by 2030, US oil and gas supply would account for half of the global amount. And by 2050, it would be 90%. So basically, in terms of equity, there's no question that there's not space for the US to continue expanding its fossil fuel production. And in fact, what's required in the US is a managed decline of fossil fuel production. And I just want to also point out the impact of subsidies on, because I'm going to be talking about a different kind of subsidy shortly after this, but existing subsidies, this is from a report by Stockholm Environment Institute and EarthTrack that was also turned into a peer-reviewed paper published in, I believe, Nature Energy. But looking at the impact of subsidies in the United States, state and federal subsidies for oil and gas production. And what they found was that nearly half of US oil production going forward is dependent on federal and state subsidies. That's at a $50 a barrel oil price, which was the oil price at the time that the analysis was conducted. The analysis is somewhat sensitive to oil price, but it's I just think it's quite an interesting finding, and it just illustrates the degree to which the industry is reliant on continued forms of government support. Which brings me to the next and last section of my presentation, which is why, how is this being justified by people who actually at least pretend to care about climate change in the US context, or who do really care about climate change? Well, a lot of them are saying we can afford to expand US oil and gas production because we can simply inject CO2 into the ground as a way to extract more oil. And that process is called carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. And our view, based on an analysis that we produced in 2017, is that it's not a climate solution. I think it's something Carol will be talking a little bit more about in the presentation as well. But just to give you an example of how this is being framed in the US context, this is an article from the Financial Times from recently where their chief executive said that Occidental Petroleum, which is one of the major players in the Permian Basin in the United States, intends to become carbon neutral over time because they're relying on this carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery. That sounds nice, but in the bottom right of your screen here, you can see my reaction to that, which is that it's absurd for an oil company to be saying this. It's a fairy tale. And so why would we say something like that? Well, it's based on the analysis that we produced in 2017 that I mentioned, looking at specific provisions in the tax code for expanding CO2 enhanced oil recovery. Unfortunately, these new expanded incentives for carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery did pass and are now part of the tax code. And basically what that looks like is, from a CO2 EOR perspective, is $35 a ton for a tax credit for carbon dioxide injected for use in processes like enhanced oil recovery. And this is the next couple of slides are a wall of text. I apologize for that, but I wanted to make sure that I could get through the material in a timely way. And what we found in our analysis is that this new tax credit could result in at least an additional 400,000 barrels per day of oil production in 2035, and possibly far more, which would represent about 51 million metric tons of carbon dioxide annually. And I think also notable, which some people don't focus on in this, because a lot of the proponents of this are also thinking that, hey, we can just capture CO2 from coal plants and inject that into the ground to produce more oil, which I think for many of us on the call probably intuitively sounds like a bad idea, but it certainly wasn't the case for a lot of proponents of this tax credit. But it extends the lifetime of coal plants, and even if they're sequestering some of their carbon dioxide, we've still got all the local air pollution and criteria air contaminants and other issues that affect local communities, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. Subsidies for carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, our finding would actually likely increase rather than decrease net emissions. And that's because each barrel of oil, this is sort of the key point, I think, and the key argument about the subsidy, each barrel of oil extracted contains more carbon than is injected to recover it. Thus, the idea that carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery will decrease emissions hinges on the belief that new oil production from carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery will simply displace oil produced elsewhere on sort of a one-to-one basis, or a nearly one-to-one basis. So if you have a new barrel of oil produced in the US from carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, then it might mean that a barrel in Saudi Arabia or in Iran or in Canada doesn't get produced. But what happens in reality is that new oil production will tend to induce some additional demand, all things being equal, especially if generous subsidies make existing reserves of oil cheaper to produce. And just to illustrate this, there are lots of sort of estimates, and it's very context dependent on what the sort of this displacement factor or the market effect of a new barrel of oil coming on the market is. But one example of that kind of a factor is the US Department of Interior, so hardly the most progressive institution in the world, or in the US government for that matter. Their own modeling of what would happen with new offshore oil leases suggests that about 50% of oil produced from new offshore leases would displace existing production, while 50% would represent additional global production added to global markets that would induce additional demand. And this same 50% factor applied to CO2 enhanced oil recovery would actually mean that every barrel of CO2 enhanced oil recovery, CO2 enhanced oil produced would actually increase net emissions rather than decrease them. And just very quickly here, I also want to just, I won't go through all of this, but focusing on who the benefits accrue to as well. So the portion of 45Q that benefits the oil industry can cost US taxpayers about $3 billion annually, possibly even more than that, and based on our analysis. And the vast bulk of credits to date under this tax provision have gone to big oil and gas players like ExxonMobil. And our concern as well, there's a political economy concern here, which is we're dumping more public money into some of the companies that are the most vocal opponents of serious and ambitious climate action. And that's something else I think we need to consider. And then finally, this point that I made earlier in passing is that we know not only from coal-fired power plants or gas plants where the CO2 would be captured to then be injected into the ground, but also the oil and gas production, the local impacts and the impacts on communities of that are really significant. I was recently in California and just seeing how close some of the oil and gas production is to really dense residential areas is really concerning. So our view from this analysis is that subsidizing the expansion of the fossil fuel industry, even through carbon dioxide enhanced oil recovery, is not a solution to the climate crisis. And I just want to recognize before I wrap up as well that more recent work has been done to further unpack the subsidy and its implications, notably by CIEL, and I think with the Fuel Fire report that I think Carol's going to speak to, as well as Clean Water Action has done some really good work looking at the actual implications and implementation of this subsidy. So that's it for me, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. I'm Carol Muffett with the Center for International Environmental Law. And as Alex said, we recently completed a new report called Fuel to the Fire that examined the linkages between fossil fuels and geoengineering. The report looked at those linkages over the last several decades, looking at how the history of the evolution of geoengineering and the investment in and control of the technologies and the research has shaped both the research agenda and the economic prospects for geoengineering going forward. As Lily alluded, the IPCC has made clear that it is imperative that we keep the world below 1.5 degrees of warming, and that to achieve that, we need to reduce CO2 emissions 58% by 2030 and 97% by 2050. IPCC's most conservative pathway for achieving these goals, Pathway 1, lays out a strategy for achieving 1.5 degrees without reliance on CCS or other geoengineering technologies. To do so requires reducing coal by 97% by 2050, reducing oil by 87%, and reducing gas by 74%. As I think Sven will tell you, the actual reductions that are needed are even deeper than that. And as Alex has laid out, the oil and gas that we already have developed is well beyond what will take us above 1.5 degrees and even jeopardize the ability to achieve 2 degrees. Why does this matter in the context of geoengineering? Because in the wake of the IPCC's report, there has been a rush of public media coverage and public discourse suggesting that we are out of time and that the only way to respond to the climate crisis now is to begin making massive new investments in an array of geoengineering technologies. Lily laid out the two broad categories of geoengineering: carbon dioxide removal technologies that seek to remove CO2 from the atmosphere after it's already been emitted, and solar radiation modification or management technologies that seek to modify the Earth's radiation balance to alter heat absorption at regional or global levels and temporarily mask but not eliminate the effects of anthropogenic warming. One of the critical things to understand about the reliance on geoengineering, and particularly carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal in IPCC models and national determined contributions, is that almost all of those models are dependent on the widespread deployment of carbon capture and storage. Whether you talk about carbon capture and storage itself as a part of models, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or direct air capture with carbon capture and storage. This reliance on CCS is itself a critical component of the vast majority of carbon dioxide removal strategies. Why does that matter? Because as Alex was suggesting, currently CO2 with enhanced oil recovery is currently the only commercially ready process that allows for simultaneous utilization and storage of industrial scale volumes of CO2. There are proposals to use captured CO2 in an array of processes, from producing plastics, which has its own problems and its own consequences, to producing new fuels, to storing it in various materials. But the only of these processes that is available at any scale and has shown any market potential is CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. And as Alex alluded, the problem with this is that when this is actually injected into abandoned or depleted wells, what comes out is more oil. The only way that models reliant on CO2 EOR can make the math add up, the only way those models can generate negative emissions over any frame of time, is to ignore the emissions that are associated with the oil that is produced, either by arguing, and as Alex I think effectively rebutted, the idea of displacement, or simply, as in the case of a recent presentation by advocates from NORSA, arguing that industry, even after investing in injection, will continue to inject CO2 long after it is economically viable to do so. This, however, runs directly in the contrary of the economic models that underlie CO2 EOR. CO2 EOR is not the only technology that is being explored and actively promoted in the geoengineering space. We've seen a growing interest and growing advocacy around the concept of direct air capture. Direct air capture is profoundly more energy intensive than traditional carbon capture and storage, because it depends on sucking the carbon from the ambient air itself, where the carbon is present at far lower concentrations and thus requires substantially more energy inputs to pull out. Here as well, however, the majority of business cases for direct air capture technologies assume that the only way to profit from that direct air capture is either to turn the captured carbon back into a combustible fuel, whether it's jet fuel or drop-in fuels, which would tend to exacerbate and perpetuate the fossil fuel economy, or again, to use the captured carbon to produce still more oil. Thus, in the context of direct air capture, you have a situation in which one of three things is going on. Either you are burning tremendous amounts of gas and coal to power a direct air capture facility, releasing massive amounts of emissions to do so, or you are burning the same gas and coal itself with carbon capture and storage and using that to power the direct air capture facility. Or finally, you are powering the entire process with renewable energy. Only in the third situation, where direct air capture is powered completely by renewable energy, can there be any prospect of carbon negative outcomes. And to assess whether that carbon negative potential is realistic, it's important to consider what alternative uses those massive amounts of renewable energy would have been put to if they weren't powering direct air capture to produce more fuels for combustion or more oil for production. In the months since we released our report, we have seen a rash of new investments in direct air capture companies by major oil companies, precisely because they have identified EOR as a key market opportunity for this direct air capture. So here again, we're seeing a geoengineering technology put forth as a solution, when in reality what it is most likely to do is exacerbate the problem. Even beyond EOR, as I was alluding, the other prominent use of direct air capture is in the production of drop-in combustible fuels. The challenge with that, even beyond the energy consumption required to run the direct air capture processes themselves, is that by definition, drop-in fuels, drop-in combustion fuels can be at best only carbon neutral, not carbon negative. And in the meantime, they necessitate the continued existence of substantial amounts of fossil fuel infrastructure and transport infrastructure that is based on internal combustion engines. The IEA's Greenhouse Gas Working Group has been profoundly explicit about the real rationale for the promotion of CO2 and CCS. That rationale is not about addressing the climate problem, not for the industry. CO2, CCS and CCUS and CO2 EOR are at their heart about making unburnable carbon burnable, at providing a rationale for continuing to exploit reserves well past the point when we know we can no longer exploit them. This is most evident in the coal industry. We've talked about the role of CCS in the oil industry, but for the coal industry, CCS is literally a lifeline to the future. Nowhere is this more evident than in the front page of the website of Europe's leading CO2 and CCS industry website, CO2 GeoNet, and their website is literally a smokestack with rainbows coming out of it. Alex talked about carbon-sucking unicorns, and he's not exaggerating. This, for the industry, is a magical solution to a very real problem. That the IEA would continue to promote such solutions shouldn't be surprising when you look at the composition of the IEA's Greenhouse Gas Working Group. That working group is dominated by oil companies, by gas companies, by coal companies, by integrated utilities, all of whom have a direct, vested, and significant interest in the continuation of the status quo. And it is that reliance on CCS, on CCUS, and on geoengineering in other forms, and the assumption of future negative emissions that allows oil companies like ExxonMobil and Shell to project continued heavy reliance on oil and gas through at least the end of this century, long past the point where we know we must have ended our reliance on fossil fuels. I want to touch very briefly on a couple of other points. First, CCS is not the only approach to geoengineering that benefits fossil fuels. One of the other prominent approaches to carbon dioxide removal, one of the technological approaches, is called enhanced weathering and mineralization. The idea being that you accelerate the natural mineralization processes that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere. Unfortunately, to undertake those processes would require mining up to 4 times the scale of existing annual coal production. One alternative to this, however, is that you could actually use coal combustion waste as a mineralization tool, and we see the industry promoting this. This has the dual benefits of giving the industry credits for carbon dioxide removal and simultaneously dealing with a toxic, high-volume waste stream that has proved unmanageable over decades. I want to spend, finally, a few minutes talking about solar radiation modification. And I want to focus principally on stratospheric aerosol injection because that is the most widely touted approach to SRM. CIEL's research actually into Smoke and Fumes, the early history of what the oil industry knew about climate change and wind, uncovered numerous examples of early research by the oil and gas industries into how their products might be used in active weather modification operations at an array of scales, including the use of carbon black and jet fuels and other materials to modify the Earth's albedo and change reflectivity to redirect hurricanes, to melt large areas of Arctic ice, or to cause localized warming over various areas. The problem with these technologies is that we know that the injection of aerosols, and particularly sulfur dioxide, into the atmosphere has profound consequences for the global environment. Indeed, the world's experience, not only with early ozone loss, but with acid rain, was driven by the accumulation of sulfur dioxide and other related pollutants into the atmosphere as a result of fossil fuel combustion. What is remarkable is to see how the technologies that were initially proposed by the oil industry decades ago to open new profit streams for their products are now being, are now being closely reflected in proposals to actually inject stratospheric aerosols into the high atmosphere. One of the final things, and I know I need to wrap up, but one of the final things that I want to note about the rise in SRM is the repeated reliance on SRM by advocates who note that a principal goal and a principal utility of SRM has been and has been repeatedly recognized as the ability to adopt less ambitious current targets, or to use SRM and the management of radiation as an alternative to ambitious emission reductions. This is really important because many advocates of SRM will deny vigorously that there is any goal in the deployment of geoengineering other than the protection of the planet from the worst impacts of warming. I think for many people involved in the SRM discussions, this may be true. But if you look at the history of SRM proposals, the history of SRM research, and much more importantly, the history of industry advocacy for SRM and related technologies, what you find is a recurring theme that SRM is useful principally because it provides an alternative to early aggressive reductions in greenhouse emissions. David Keith, who is both the founder of direct air capture company Carbon Engineering and a leading advocate of SRM, said in 1992, "The notion of geoengineering as a fallback option provides a central, or perhaps the only justification for taking large-scale geoengineering seriously. A fallback strategy permits more confidence in adopting a moderate response to the climate problem. Without fallback options, a moderate response is risky, given the possibility of a strong climatic response to moderate levels of fossil fuel combustion." In other words, the principal benefit of advocating geoengineering is that it allows lower levels of near-term ambition in actually reducing emissions and undertaking the societal transformation that is actually required. I want to finally say just a word on marine cloud brightening, only to note that marine cloud brightening is also receiving growing attention as a potential solution to climate change. It is an alternate approach to SRM. One of the things that is most striking about marine cloud brightening proposals, however, is the profound degree to which they ignore the likely consequences of this interference in changes to monsoon patterns, to rainfall patterns across large areas of the Earth, and at often tremendous distances from the place where the aerosols are being injected. This highlights one of the fundamental risks that we face as we begin to explore geoengineering, is that not only do we risk entrenching and perpetuating a fossil fuel system and generating still more new emissions, but we also, and equally critically, risk unleashing a whole array of new risks that to date we still only poorly understand. I'll leave you with a final thought, and that is that geoengineering has become a favorite of a growing number of climate denialists. The idea that we can make the problem of climate change go away or disappear by masking it with new technologies has been embraced by a surprising number of active climate denialists, not only in the public discourse, but much more critically in decision-making spaces up to and including the U.S. Congress. We have seen this over and over again, including in the months after we released our initial report. And the final note I'll leave you with is, as Sven will tell you, we do not need to take on these risks. It is possible to achieve a 1.5 degree world without the need for geoengineering. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sven.
Thank you. I'm sharing my screen now. Hang on a sec. This screen. Okay, you should see my screen now. Okay, yeah, this presentation is about the OneEarth climate model. And we published a book in February, a 500-page book where we document the entire project. This project is a 1.5-year work financed by the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation under leadership of the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology in Sydney, the University of Melbourne, and the German Aerospace Center, DLR. What we have done in our energy scenario, what we developed, 100% renewable energy scenario, which was part of that work, is that we took the global trends in the energy sector into account. We include the higher shares of variable power generation. We took into account the ongoing digitalization of electricity and sector coupling, so that transport and the heating sector are moving closer and closer via electrification together. The project scope was to develop a 100% renewable energy scenario to decarbonize the entire global energy sector within one generation. We take only technologies into account which are either in the market or at the end stage of the development, so before they enter in the market. One example would be ocean energy. We have a small amount of ocean energy in our scenario, and we exclude biomass, CCS, and nuclear energy. We have a reference case based on the 10 world regions. We use the reference case, the current policy scenarios from the International Energy Agency, the World Energy Outlook. The IEA's World Energy Outlook is basically the most quoted and most recognized global energy scenario for the world, and they have specific regions, and we took them so we can compare that with the World Energy Outlook. We take all sectors into account, I already said that, and we do a power sector analysis where we model electricity generation and demand in an hourly resolution basis. In order to calculate storage demand, increase interconnection between regions, and last but not least, we also included non-energy related greenhouse gas emission scenarios, such as land use change and so on. All pathways are evaluated in regard to their implicit use of the carbon budget and their exceedance probabilities for 1.5 and 2 degrees. Before I jump into the results, I just wanted to briefly give an overview about the methodology. Our team, we were almost 20 scientists in 3 different regions. We use different models. We had a resource model, we called it the ReSpace. It's a GIST-based renewable energy mapping tool where we map the entire world, check where the average wind speeds, if we check wind, is over 5 meters per second on an annual basis, which is basically the lowest threshold for use of wind power. And then we map the available space for utility scale wind turbines. That means we excluded nature conservation areas, agricultural land to a large extent, urban areas, roads, and all the other infrastructure. So basically, there's only a fraction of the land use or land space actually available for utility scale applications. We did the same for solar. And so we have sort of an upper limit of how many utility scale solar and wind technology applications we can actually use in the different regions. We broke down the 10 world regions into 7 to 8 sub-regions that led us to 72 different regions, which are quite often countries like China, India, where we broke it actually further down to 5. Then we have a transport model, which basically means that we have a bottom-up approach to model the transport demand based both in terms of freight and passenger transport for road, rail, and aviation and marine transport. Then we have all this, basically those 2 inputs go into the energy system model that has been operated by the German Aerospace Center, DLR, to generate a scenario which is basically based on roughly the same methodology as the World Energy Outlook. So we have a comparable set of scenarios. We have 3 scenarios, a 5-degree scenario, which is the reference case, a 2 degrees, and a 1.5-degree scenario. And the outputs of the output of the energy system model, the electricity part goes into the power system model where we calculate the 1-hour steps. So it's a fairly huge amount of work and huge amount of calculation. So that took us 1.5 years, but the beauty of it is we have a very, very detailed idea of how the energy transition should look like in the future. On the next slide, I just wanted to show you the renewable energy assessment. This is the result of Africa. The blue part is basically the area which is suitable for wind. The green and red parts are not. If we would zoom into the green parts, you would still see quite a few blue dots. So there is a high resolution where we have wind potential almost for every country. There are very few countries which have a very low wind potential, like the one I'm currently actually working on, Bangladesh. But the majority of the countries has a very good or superb wind resource. Same for solar. We have different assumptions for our models. The reference case, as I said, is the IEA World Energy Outlook current policy scenarios. And the 2-degree scenario is that we have a 590 gigaton budget until 2050. and it's efficiency and renewable energy driven, and we assume a rapid expansion of renewable electricity across the industry and electrification across all sectors. However, we also included some sort of a buffer in terms of how quick we actually accelerate. While the 1.5 degree scenario has 450 gigatons, and that's not enough to reach 1.5 degrees. Therefore, we actually have to have negative emission. I'm coming back to that at the end of my presentation. We have, it's quite similar to the 2 degree scenario, but accelerated, and it requires immediate action to actually get this. And we have this one, I would actually call it a technical benchmark scenario. So this is what we did in terms of the renewable energy and energy efficiency transition and expansion is probably the quickest you can actually do in the real world if the whole world agrees. Beyond that, I would argue that it might not be possible, because you also have we also have to train people, like experts in renewable energy installation, manufacturing, all this, that takes time as well. The transport model, the 5 degrees scenario, on the left side, you see aviation and cars, and basically all transport forms go through the roof, while the 2 degrees and 1.5 degree scenario, the main expansion is passenger trains, where we have almost more than tripling of passenger trains on a global scale over the next 30 years. So a mode shift from aviation and road to rail is implemented and included in that calculation, in that scenario for all regions, some regions more than others. And also what we take into account is that electric mobility is not just electric vehicles, but also public transport. The key results of the global energy potential, the good news is we have more than enough. So the renewable energy potential limit is not a limit in each of the 72 regions we actually modeled. In some regions, as I said, Bangladesh, we are pushing the limits, both in terms of utility scale, solar and wind, but in most regions, we have more than enough. The potential is calculated in square kilometers and in gigawatts. The reason why we have 2 parameters is that the gigawatt figure could change with new technologies, so you might get a bit more installed capacity out of the same area. So I made a circle about around the North American and the European results. They are all documented in the book. The next one is it shows the energy intensity. So the energy intensity is the amount of energy we need per GDP, per dollar GDP. And also the reference case assumes that the efficiency, the energy intensity goes down by almost 50%, even in the reference case. However, if we implement efficiency measures faster and more, and one of the reasons why we have even more efficiency is that we have a fairly high electrification rate, which basically means we have a higher efficiency in terms of the energy use, because electric drives, for example, are far more efficient than a combustion engine. The global final energy demand, as a result, obviously goes down, and you see the energy demand per sector: industry, transport, and residential, and other sectors, which is basically buildings and agriculture. And the main savings are in the transport sector, followed by the industry sector. In terms of the final electricity demand by sector, again, globally, due to electrification, obviously the electricity demand of the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees scenario increases significantly and is much higher than in the reference case. We have also an increased demand for hydrogen production, which we have in the system, especially for large-scale transport vehicles like trucks and also ships. We do not use hydrogen for aviation. We use biofuels. We have a very limited amount of biofuels in this scenario. In terms of the electricity generation, obviously solar and wind dominate. And on the right in the table, you see the amount of capacity required. That's quite a lot of capacity. So you see, for example, solar photovoltaics will go up to around 12,500 megawatts. We currently have the 2050 number was 225 gigawatts. We have around 400 gigawatts now. So we have to accelerate, and we increase the annual global market from currently around 100 gigawatts to around 450 to 500 gigawatts a year. The second most important technology is wind, and offshore wind has a specific and very important role to play as well. The good news is that with the investments in renewables, we save a lot of fuels. And that means that we can refinance the additional investment cost with fuel cost savings to almost 90% in the 1.5 degree scenario. Obviously, that has quite an uncertainty, because depending on how you sort of estimate the fuel costs in the future, but the fuel cost estimation in this calculation is based on the IEA projection for fuel costs high price, which is currently actually a normal price. The problem with fuel price projections is that there is a very high certainty that they're completely wrong. And therefore, we never do our own fuel cost projections. We always take the so-called official projection from the IEA, even though that almost everyone knows that those projections are utterly wrong. And historically, you see that in some graphs are entirely sort of off track. In terms of transport, as I said already, we reduce a significant amount of transport demand in both 2.5 and in the 2 degrees and 1.5 degree scenario, and that's due to electrification, but also module shift. So we have in urban areas, we move the majority of the transport to public transport and away from individual transport, where obviously public transport in rural areas won't really work. And therefore, we do have individual transport in our scenario, but in cities, we try to move people around by public transport, usually electric systems like light rails, but electric buses as well. And other electric vehicles, I think in the long run, even electric bikes and electric tricycles can play a very important role. The global primary energy supply on a global level decreases as well, but that's due to electrification. In terms of, because we have the same parameter I just showed you for the world, we have that for all the 10 regions. And you see that in some regions, the demand grows significantly, like in Africa. The global bunker fuel supply, which is interesting because many scenarios don't actually have bunker fuel in their calculation. Bunker fuel is the fuel supply for international aviation and marine transport, and we supply this via synfuels and via biofuels. The aviation sector uses biofuels, not hydrogen. I think that people are very sensitive on hydrogen and aviation, even 100 years after the Hindenburg accident happened. And we have a lot of savings, which means we have a more local production, which reduces the requirement for global shipments, but also we have a reduction of international air traffic. Those synthetic fuels, renewable synthetic fuels, are produced in Africa, the Middle East, and Australia to a large extent. they're basically produced in the US as well, but Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, and Australia have by far the largest potential to produce far more than the region actually needs. CO2-wise, this is how it looks like. We have in 2040, we are down to 7 gigatons a year on a global level, CO2, energy-related CO2 in a 1.5 degree scenario, only 2.6. And it goes to zero in both cases in 2050. I think it's very important to note that if we would emit the same amount of carbon over sort of in the future, our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees would be depleted in 9 years. So we actually have to reduce very quickly. I just wanted to briefly touch the power sector analysis. So we have done, as I said, a power sector analysis where we check the electricity structure, the generation structure, and we will end up with a variable renewables, so that's solar PV and wind, from currently around 5% to 65%. Dispatchable fossil fuels decreases from 60% to 7%. So basically fossil fuels, which will at the end then be replaced by hydrogen for the remaining part, will only have a dispatch job, not a supply job, but a dispatch job in order to reduce the storage requirement. We have no power plants in the baseload supply region because we can't simply afford that. That's another reason why CCS and nuclear won't work in this model, because our priority access for electricity in the grid is solar and wind. So we take all the wind and all the solar first, and if there is still some missing, then we jump in with others. There's a cascade of different technologies. So there's absolutely no room for a technology which produces 24/7, no matter what solar and wind production we have. But CCS is well, if you operate CCS power plant and nuclear, you want to operate it as many hours as possible a year to make the specific generation cost per kilowatt hour possible. I skipped that. The load development in the region is very different. The overall load, not the demand, also the demand, but also the load increases because we have a lot of electric mobility. And electric mobility obviously needs charging, and charging creates more load. But also access to energy creates more load, and you see that Africa by far has the highest increase load, but all other regions also increase load. North America, for example, almost doubles load, and that's only due to the fact that they have a lot of electric mobility. Storage, I think it's too much to read. It's in the book. We have a significant amount of investment into storage, not just batteries, but also where possible hydro pump storage. And there are possibilities to have a hydro pump storage also in sort of at the coast. There is a study, a very interesting study for Australia, shown that near the cliffs there's a saltwater hydro pump storage possibility. Right now there's only one application in the world, which is in Japan, but in some region that might be an interesting application as well. Very important to say, we do not increase large scale hydro, so no further dams in this scenario. We obviously, with this scenario, we have a required fossil fuel resource trajectory. So we need to reduce, with a 2 degree scenario, 2% per annum and 1.5 minus 3 per annum from now on. And that might be a no-brainer, but it seems to be that in the community, in the modeling community, it seems to be not a consensus that decarbonizing the energy system means that we actually don't use hydrocarbons. don't really understand intellectually why people think that's not connected to each other, but the problem is that many people think we can actually disconnect it with CCS, for example, and that's the problem. Another thing is that with this trajectories, we need to make sure that we have a just transition, which means we should not actually just abandon the workers, and that's why we have done a very detailed scenario analysis for this scenario for the workers. Finally, I close with this image. You have seen that slide also at the last presentation, at the last slide. So with all these technical details, and it's pretty hard to put 500 pages and 1.5 years in 10 minutes. So basically, to give a brief overview, I invite you to download the book. It's free from the web, and just have a closer look. But even with all this technical implementation and decarbonization of the energy system, we also need to stop deforestation and start reforestation in order to get the negative emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees, or at maximum 1.5 degrees. And we have, on top of that, which I have done no time for it, we have done an analysis for the required metals in terms of silver, lithium, and cobalt, and other metals, which has been published actually yesterday with, and that work has been financed by Earthworks, a US-based NGO. And with this, I close. This is the link to the book, and you're invited to download it. And I hand over now to our debate again.
Great. Thank you to all the presenters. So now we're actually going to start the Q&A section of the webinar. So if you have any questions, you can submit them by putting them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And our first question is from Morel Goldsmith. What are the most important issues in relation to geoengineering to raise with legislators in the US Congress right now? And I think Lily will be starting us off answering that question.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question, since the US Congress is one of those places, legislative sort of places, where the issue has been discussed already. That's an exception to the. There are not many parliaments that have dealt with the question of geoengineering. So it's three things that come to my mind. One is that we've, as Alex and others have explained, there's a concern around new additional subsidies, public support for geoengineering technologies, for CCS, for enhanced oil recovery, direct air capture. All of that, and I think we'll see, I assume we'll see a lot more push like that in the US Congress going forward. So that's something to raise as a concern. There's also been, I think there has been an event just recently on climate restoration, which could mean many, many things. But in these events on climate restoration, we've seen in the past some of the very prominent geoengineering, including solar geoengineering advocates, presenting and being quite heavily engaged. So that's one thing to raise. The other thing that's key for the US is that there are a number of outdoor experiments for solar geoengineering planned and scheduled. The most well-known one, I guess, is the SCOPEX experiment proposed by the Keith and Koich group at Harvard University. It was scheduled to take place, first they thought last year, now maybe this year, now it might be delayed again. They're setting up a governance structure just for that experiment. It's quite controversial. And then there's also a marine cloud brightening project in Northern California, and there's a solar geoengineering outdoor experiment in Alaska that's actually already being implemented, where they're putting silica sand on the Arctic ice. It's called Ice 911. ice aid. So there's a lot of experiments planned, or some of them already implemented in the US, a lot of them on indigenous territories and land, and there is local opposition to that. And I think that the fact that geoengineering experiments are the question over rights to territories is one thing to raise with legislators, but also that it is, the world is watching what's happening in the US on that issue right now, and it's quite concerning that the US is going forward with outdoor experiments without any sort of consensus on that question at the international level. And that was going to be my last point, that we've just recently seen the US acting on geoengineering governance at a UN meeting at the United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi in March, where the US with Saudi Arabia, so two of the major oil producing countries, basically prevented a resolution on geoengineering governance that was introduced by Switzerland, and basically did that because they didn't want to see we were unwilling to accept any form of oversight over research and development of these technologies. And it was quite, one of the few countries, the US, that came with a very well prepared position and lobbying strategy to that meeting in Nairobi. Oh, and then the one thing I still wanted to mention was that there is a Space to Watch is an upcoming report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine in the US that has just formed a committee to work on a new report on developing a research agenda and research governance approaches for climate intervention strategies that reflect sunlight to cool Earth. So this is about solar geoengineering, a new NAS report upcoming, and there is actually a meeting happening next Tuesday in Washington that is partly open and can be joined also remotely via Zoom for those who are interested.
Thanks, Lily. And I'll ask Alex to speak about Use It, but I wanted to flag two other relevant considerations. One, and a particularly timely one, is ensuring that the Green New Deal itself doesn't embed direct air capture or other carbon dioxide removal technologies beyond the sort of win-win natural solutions that Sven was alluding to. There is room for restoration of natural ecosystems, restoration and conservation of agricultural soils. These are all positive ways and immediately deployable ways to begin capturing carbon, but I think it's really particularly critical as the Green New Deal sets out a positive vision for how we address climate, that it doesn't itself embed more of the challenges that we face. Alex?
Thanks, yeah, and just briefly on the Use It Act, this is an act that was reintroduced in the new Congress, and I think it's basically additional subsidies and handouts, not only for research and development, but also for financing deployment of carbon capture and utilization, as well as direct air capture technologies, and also contain some elements that would streamline permitting processes for example, CO2 pipelines. So I think from my perspective, there hasn't been enough due consideration or thoughtfulness in Congress about this issue and how it intersects with the future of fossil fuel production in the US. And I think it's really important to raise it and sort of start to get people on record about what they think of the Use It Act, and to push back against additional subsidies that will help expand fossil fuel production, because it shouldn't be public money that's supporting this build out in any case.
Great. So we have another question from Neeraj. What is the potential of harnessing ocean thermal energy for power generation? Are there any significant threats to marine biodiversity?
I think that's for me. Well, I mean, this ocean thermal technology is a very, very small niche, very, very sort of limited on only Hawaii, because the ocean thermal energy, as far as I know, and I'm not really an expert on that, is only possible if you have a very, very deep part of the ocean close to the shore. And you basically use the temperature difference between the cold water in the lower part and the warmer water in the upper part. Obviously, Hawaii has the unique situation to have that geographical position, and maybe Japan as well, and that's pretty much it. So it's a very local research. I have never seen it in any of the energy scenarios ever actually used, but I wouldn't be opposed to that. But I have no knowledge of an actual practical application in a larger scale. So I would say that's sort of a wild card for the renewables. So on top of what we have on other technologies, it makes it maybe a bit easier for to diversify a bit more in terms of the renewable generation. If there is an environmental impact and what kind, I have no idea. I just know that there is no technology without an environmental impact. But we basically have to talk about what's replaced. So there is always a strategic energy environmental assessment required in order to see what can I sort of gain with that technology. But for that, I have to hand it over to someone else. If from our panel, if someone else knows more, I don't.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have from Sylvia Ribeiro is both Carol and Alex referred that both CCS and DAC are dependent on CCUS and that the only option for that is enhanced oil recovery. Could you please explain a bit more why this is?
Well, I think it's more accurate to say that the only commercially available option for using CCS in a way that is commercially viable is enhanced oil recovery right now. It is possible to use captured carbon in other processes, including, as we've talked about, in the production of combustible fuels, which which again is at best carbon neutral, and in all likelihood not even that. But the challenge is one of cost and of scale. CCS technologies, even when you are dealing with the direct capture of carbon from a point source where the carbon is concentrated, are incredibly energy intensive. And then once the carbon is captured, you of course have to pipe it, transport it to a location where it can be safely injected and stored. There are salt domes that are certainly physically capable of housing captured CCS, and this is widely reported by CCS proponents. The problem is that there's simply no economic case for and storing the CCS unless there's somebody paying you to do it. The enhanced oil recovery is the most economically viable way of paying for the costs of CCS. As I alluded to, there's been experimentation with turning captured carbon into other materials, including building materials, and increasingly captured carbon is being promoted for the use of plastics and other petrochemicals. Even independent of the separate environmental impacts that would be associated with those processes, however, they are inherently limited in their capacity. EOR is the only one of those processes that has the sort of scale that could capture carbon and store it at large volumes. Alex?
Yeah, just quickly, I just totally agree with what Carol said. I'll just add, in the U.S. context, one of the reasons why the CO2 EOR would be the sort of predominant fate of captured CO2 at the moment is because the value of the tax credit for CO2 utilized is $35 a ton, whereas the value of the credit for CO2 that's just directly sequestered into the ground is $50 a ton. and the overall economics of the additional money that companies are able to get selling the CO2 plus the credit are more favorable than that $50 a ton value. So even the Department of Energy's own modeling suggests that the vast majority, if not all, credits at this point would likely be flowing for the foreseeable future to CO2 EOR rather than injecting the CO2 directly into the ground without sort of a utilization purpose. So it's, as Carol said, it's sort of not the only option, but at the moment that's kind of where things look like they're heading in the US.
So the next question we have is from Doreen Stravinsky. Do the energy scenarios include cost of an energy transition and possibilities for mobilizing funding?
Yes, what we calculate in energy scenarios is usually not just the investment cost in new equipment, but also the fuel costs and the capital costs and labor, operation and maintenance. We calculate the same for the heating demand and supply. And I haven't seen any global scenario which can actually calculate the costs of transport on a global level. That's what we can see is how much fuel we need in terms of transport. But the actual costs for a transition from road to rail is, I would say, on a global level, impossible to calculate. I don't know. There is nothing available on a global level in terms of the scientific literature. We were actually looking for it. What we do for infrastructure in the entire energy supply system is we have very, very robust figures in terms of infrastructural costs for different technologies, for different infrastructure like power grids, increased power grids. Obviously, when we have more electricity and we replace fuels with electricity, we need more power grids and we also need more storage. This is what we calculate. That's included. Yeah, that's basically it. What an energy scenario does not do is we cannot simulate or sort of calculate the entire world financial flows related to all the other sectors. That doesn't work. But in terms of energy transition cost, maybe to add that, we are right now in a very comfortable position that new renewable generation is almost everywhere in the world already cheaper than new fossil fuel. Nuclear is light years more expensive than anything else you can have in terms of investment costs. So that drops out anyway. But in terms of, like if we compare with gas and oil, renewables are now equal price and quite often already cheaper. So we don't really need subsidies. What we calculate in our scenarios is that renewables do not get any subsidies, just better policies. So we can actually change the market system. And market system, I mean that, for example, solar and wind needs to have priority access to the grid. So if you have a cable and if you have, like, say, generation from solar and wind and coal, solar and wind should feed in the grid first and then coal, not the other way around, because otherwise coal might fill up the grid and just blocks more renewables, which happens right now in some regions. And then you have to curtail or store renewable electricity. So this is what we need, and what we need is also to phase out fossil fuel subsidies, because sometimes renewables are not competitive because they have to compete against subsidized generation, and we need to take that off the equation. But other than that, we don't really need subsidies.
So from Chris Friedler, the UK has recently started its first BECCS pilot plant, which it claims is a world first. What are the panel's thoughts on the impacts of that?
I'll start. I'm not familiar with the plant specifically. We did look at BECCS pilot plants and existing BECCS projects in our report, and found was that the most recent global review of BECCS projects that we could locate, which reviewed BECCS projects through 2015, of 5 BECCS projects operating or in development globally, 3 of them were designed for use in enhanced oil recovery. A 4th one was still under assessment as to what the use would be for the captured carbon, and a 5th was for storage in a salt dome. And so I think our critique of BECCS would be the same in these cases, with the additional caveat that when you're looking at bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, you also have to consider the likely significant emissions that arise from land use change for producing the materials themselves, and the associated emissions that go with producing biofuel crops. To determine whether there would be a net benefit from any BECCS project, you would essentially have to be able to demonstrate that the full life cycle of that, at least carbon neutral. Over it suggests that they are very unlikely to be, particularly when you try to deploy them at any meaningful scale.
Maybe I can just add, I'm also not an expert on the DRAX specific project, but I want to alert people to the great work that Biofuel Watch has done in the UK on that. I'll post the link to their article in a second, but basically what they demonstrate, and in addition to the problems around BECCS more generally that Carol already explained, that the DRAX project isn't really a BECCS trial. It's a startup company's test whether a new solvent may or may not be capable of capturing CO2 from flue gases. And there's also been some funny stories actually last year around the DRAX trial, because they basically were advertising their test by saying that they would produce the CO2 for beer. And would keep the fizz in beer. So that was funny in a way, but then Biofuel Watch concluded, for anyone confused about what any of this is supposed to have to do with climate change, nothing much. And I think that's a very good conclusion. I'll post the link to their article.
Okay, so from Doreen Stravinsky, Sven, could you say a bit more about the land use elements of the OneEarth scenario, carbon sequestration potential in natural ecosystems, etc.?
Yes, although I've been the project leader of the entire project, I have to admit that I cannot do all the different calculations in detail. So I try my best, and then the rest I would suggest to just download the book and check what the team in the University of Melbourne has done. So what we have done, or what Malte Meishausen has done and his team, was that they calculated the effects of land use change in greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the main graphs we had, I don't have that on the slide here, main graphs was what effect has the protection of forests, especially tropical rainforests, and what effect has it in terms of negative carbon emissions, so in terms of as carbon sinks. And it turns out that the protection of tropical rainforest is by far the most important measure in terms of stop deforestation to get the negative emissions. So maybe I turn it around and say the best CCS technology is actually a tropical rainforest, and just don't touch it. Rather than chopping down a forest, burning it, and squeeze the CO2 into the ground. So from that perspective, the forests actually have a very important role to play. And it's not enough that we stop deforestation, not just in the tropics, but everywhere. We also need to start reforestation. And we had quite a radical approach where we assumed that all the forests, sort of the area of forests, will go back to the area we had in the beginning of the last century. So it's a substantial amount of reforestation, and there were also simulation of the agricultural land. But I'm not in details. I can't really say any qualified I can't give any qualified information about that. So I would rather suggest to look in the book and check it online. But for me, the very important message is there are no low-hanging fruits. Not just like, should we go first in stop deforestation, or should we go first in efficiency, or should we go first in renewables? We all have to do it. All is equally important, and we have to do it at the same time. We have absolutely no low-hanging fruits left. We have to do everything, and especially in the energy sector, we always have that stupid debate if efficiency is more important than renewables. No. Also, renewables are not more important than efficiency. It's both equally important, and to sort of play one against each other doesn't make sense, and it's just confusing the topic. Even if we have that very ambitious energy scenario, we still need to take care of preserving our forests.
This is Carol. If I could just quickly follow up on that and say that Kate Dooley, who was one of the lead co-authors of the chapter in Sven's book, also led the development of a similar report by the Climate Land Ambition and Rights Alliance, or CLARA, which looked at the potential for win-win solutions in forest recovery, in natural ecosystems, to both recover carbon and also to benefit communities. Because I think this is a critical and often a missing piece in assessments of the potential for CDR. Is it actually socially acceptable? Is it environmentally acceptable on other grounds? And what both the CLARA analysis found and what Kate and her co-authors found in Sven's report is that there are multiple routes to using natural systems to increase the storage capacity of carbon. Those generally have the benefit of being readily deployable, of having multiple co-benefits in terms of food security and community security. They often depend on protecting and securing indigenous land rights and land tenure. I've included a linked chapter 7 of our report, which includes a couple of useful, relevant graphs, both from Sven's book and from the CLARA report. So you can find it there. And I think Lily has also included the CLARA report itself, which I highly recommend.
So the next question from Stephen Feit is, pipelines were briefly mentioned, but can the presenters speak a bit more about the pipeline infrastructure requirements and energy water inputs for CCS and DAC and the potential local harms?
Alex, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll be a bit brief here as well, because to be honest, I'm not an extremely deep expert on this. I basically know what I know about this from reading some of the work from CIEL, but from Clean Water Action as well. But one of the issues in terms of water risk is CO2 injection. It's actually not just injecting CO2. Often there are other fluids in addition to CO2 being injected, including polymers, as well as maybe re-injecting produced water alongside the CO2, which can contain harmful chemicals. So I think it's something, one thing that I think is really concerning about the particular case of CO2ER in the US as well is that the sort of regulatory and monitoring requirements at the moment are pretty lax as well, in terms of preventing contamination of water. In terms of water use for CCS facilities, there are some different process approaches that have differing uses of water. Some less, I think Weyburn, for example, in Saskatchewan uses relatively little water compared to some of the other projects that are out there. But there are, as far as I know, some fairly significant potential water use, which obviously makes it unsuitable for water-stressed areas. And then the pipeline infrastructure, I would just say, if we're serious about, if proponents are serious about kind of expanding the carbon capture and storage and transportation network, we're looking at basically building out pipeline infrastructure that's probably roughly equivalent to what the gas pipeline infrastructure globally looks like today, which is a heck of a lot of infrastructure. So I think it's the potential impacts and issues with rights and land rights are, not just in the U.S. but beyond, are pretty consequential. So that's my brief and sort of non-expert take on that aspect of it.
And I think what I would add to that is that this is actually one of the least discussed but likely most significant impacts of any sort of meaningful deployment of CCS at scale. Because to have a real impact on the climate crisis, you need to be talking about deploying CCS with existing fossil fuel infrastructure, as opposed to building purpose-built new fossil fuel infrastructure just to take advantage of CCS opportunities. And most of that infrastructure is located in populous areas, which means to get the carbon away from those areas and either to salt domes where it's available for geological storage, or to the areas where it could actually be used for EOR. You were talking about running pipelines not only over vast distances, but also disproportionately through communities of color, through marginalized and poor communities. And I think the social impacts of that, both within the United States and much more broadly, have rarely been dealt with. One thing that was particularly striking for me when we were at the climate negotiations in Poland this year was the Polish coal industry talking about, with frustration, about their own experience in trying to deploy CCS, with extensive support from not only the industry but the Polish government. And there was widespread public opposition within Poland, which is an overwhelmingly coal-fired country, not only to the storage of the captured carbon on land, but to the running the pipelines out to the sea where it might be injected in CO2 EOR. And so those barriers to CCS deployment as a result of the likely opposition to pipelines are almost completely ignored in analysis of CCS's viability.
Great. So those were the last of our questions. So if the panelists have anything to say to wrap up the webinar, please go ahead.
I can start. Three things I still want to say, I guess. One is what I find quite striking is again and again in climate change discussions these days, we're being told that there are only two alternatives. There's climate disaster, or there's a future with gigantic new infrastructures of pipelines and CCS and a few actors taking control of the global thermostat. And those are the two options we have. What are you for? What are you against? Do you want climate disaster, or do you want to accept this, ugly future because it's necessary? And I think what we collectively need to understand much better, and we're already getting there, and I think that the OneEarth model is just an excellent contribution to that debate, just like the Clara report and many, many other contributions. It's just that there are a million other alternative futures that we can build collectively, and it is the fossil fuel industry and a petrochemical industry that is standing in the way of us building these alternative futures, and that they cannot be part of building that alternative future or the futures. And these futures need to be, diverse and localized, etc. So I think there's a lot more work that we need to do to break this logic of there's only A or B, or climate disaster, or a really ugly geoengineered future. And the other thing I wanted to say is this debate is only going to get more intense in the next 2 or 3 years, or beyond that is my expectation. So it does make sense to learn more, engage more, understand, and become more outspoken on some of these issues. One of the things that we're currently very worried about and wondering how to engage exactly is the upcoming 6th assessment report of the IPCC that will include and build on those 3 special reports, the one on 1.5 degrees, the one on land that is going to be out in a couple of months, the ocean one. They will be part of this new cycle of assessment of the IPCC, and we already see and know from the great outline that geoengineering will play a more important role in the 6th assessment report, including in Working Group 1, the physical science, which we think is quite worrisome. And one of the lead coordinating authors in the working group in the part that looks at sort of cross-sectoral approaches is actually an employee, a staff of Saudi Aramco, looking at geoengineering in the IPCC report. And I think that there remains a lot of work to be done in that space. And as I said, the debate is going to get more heated as we progress.
Thanks, Lily. I'd offer just a couple of closing thoughts. One, and this is where we begin, there are many people who are both well-informed and well-intentioned who are being confronted with the realities of climate change and asked to consider whether some form of geoengineering is not now a scientific necessity. And yet there's an inherent disconnect between that request to take a leap of faith on what are unproven and profoundly risky technologies, and that we can achieve our being deployed rapidly and at ever larger scales. I think one of the things that the last 2 decades demonstrates very, very clearly is that official estimates and official projections for the deployment and maturity and costs of renewable energy and electric vehicles have proven systematically and significantly too conservative. Over and over, the IEA and the Energy Information Agency have both routinely and dramatically underestimated the scale and the speed of renewable energy deployments. Indeed, there was a 2015 analysis that compared 15 different methodologies that had looked at renewable energy deployments over recent years, and found that the most accurate one was a series of energy revolution assessments that had been prepared by Sven for Greenpeace. And even those, they were, not only were they the most accurate, but in many cases, even those proved too conservative. And so at the point where even what was the radical vision of an environmental organization about what the world could be proved too conservative, that really points to how quickly the world is positioned to transform if we allow it to do so. This is fundamentally a question not of technology now, but of political will. And the promotion of geoengineering is a profound distraction from where we need to be putting energy and resources.
Okay, well, thank you very much for mentioning that. I would have not done it myself. But I have to say, even though very proud of that, that solar and wind were actually on track, I have to say one where we haven't been on track was the efficiency part, the demand part, that actually went quite a bit upwards. So I think what the lessons learned is that we see the sort of the acceleration of the implementation of new technologies is actually now in a phase where I think transition and change will be much quicker as most people think. Because at the end of the day, if you look at specific isolated applications for a shop, for a residential home, for an army base, it always ends up that the renewable option is actually the cheapest and the easiest one, because you don't need fuel supply in many cases. The only obstacle we had was sort of the storage technology. In the storage technology, we currently see the same performance, the same cost and development, like wind came first, then solar PV came second. Now batteries go in that direction. I am absolutely sure that that the storage question, in terms of technology, but also in terms of costs and even resources, because we can't rely on the current the technologies for batteries. We need more than different ones, also from the different resources. I'm pretty sure that in 10 years' time, this is not an issue anymore. What we also see, and what I have learned, is that we cannot rely on the old energy companies, like the oil companies, to actually accelerate renewable energy development, because oil and gas and coal companies can't do renewables. And the reason for that is actually simple. The fossil fuel companies are resource companies. Basically, it's dig it out, pack it, ship it. While a renewable company is a technology company. It's not a problem to, as a technology provider, to actually add a new technology, but to change the philosophy of an oil company, a resource company, and change the whole company towards a technology company, it has proven not to work. And I don't have a single example where that actually worked successfully. Oil companies now move a little bit into offshore offshore wind. That's good, but they are not leading the innovation. And I think that's an important thing to say. Last but not least, I would really try to spread the word also in NGOs, to actually not only focus on the problem part, even though I worked a long time for Greenpeace before I went to academia. But I think what we also need is more campaigning, more more political support for renewable energy policy. Because at the end of the day, renewables are actually now cost competitive. So it's a win-win situation, but quite often the actual policy framework is simply missing. So I think that's, from my point of view, I'm fairly optimistic. I'm not sure about, no, I have to rephrase it. I have to say I'm absolutely positive that we, with maybe a little bit of delay, we actually arrive roughly at the 1.5 degree scenario on the energy system, because it simply makes technical sense. And I'm an engineer, even worse, I'm a German engineer. What I'm really worried about is the whole forest deforestation, land use change topic, where we actually need to have far more success as in the past. This is something where we're definitely not on track. And that's the part where I'm really worried about. Thank you.
And I'll just very briefly, I would emphasize something I think that Carol said, and that also was sort of, it was a little bit in Lily's introduction as well, that it's really, this is in large part a move to justify the continued extraction of hydrocarbons. It's not, it's not the move toward a lot of these geoengineering solutions. It's not necessarily in a lot of cases. I think there are some well-intentioned people, as Carol indicated, and thinking people who think that this is these solutions have to be part of the toolkit. But I think there's also a lot of bad faith out there as well. And I think you look at industry sort of pushing this and pushing a narrative like Occidental is, for example, of becoming the first carbon neutral oil company, stuff that's kind of farcical on its face. And I think, you know, what we'll see increasingly in future is that the industry is fighting back against this new wave of sort of urgency and interest around climate change that's been sparked by, you know, frontline communities fighting back against extraction around the world, by the youth-led climate strikes globally, and the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees. And I just think, you know, it's incumbent on us to see that this is a pivot from industry to sort of justify their continued existence in the face of an existential threat of serious climate action, which would mean that, you know, if you look at the scenarios that's been produced, that functionally within a couple of decades, these industries more or less cease to exist, at least as far as they exist today. So I think we just have to realize that industry is going to fight sort of tooth and claw to maintain their position and market share, and they're doing everything in their power to make sure that what we're going through with the rise of renewables is an energy addition rather than an energy transition. And that's something that we've seen historically as well, as pretty much certainly since the Industrial Revolution. Every sort of energy transition has in most ways been an energy addition. So, for example, when whale oil was sort of supplanted by the discovery of hydrocarbons, it wasn't actually supplanted. Hydrocarbons enabled ships to go further and faster and actually kill and catch more whales. And the whaling industry found more products for whale oil, like margarine. So I think there's, you know, we have to think about this in the context as well of the industry sort of using a supply push strategy to really maintain their position globally. And unfortunately, the other thing, you know, Sven mentioned they're good at moving products. The other thing they're really good at doing is regulatory capture. And so I think that's why, you know, this is a very political fight, and we have to keep our elbow sharp a little bit on this. And really appreciate the opportunity to be on a great panel with folks here today, and appreciate the folks who put the energy into organizing this as well. And also thanks to all the participants for being with us, and most of you for sticking with us for the whole duration, which is quite impressive and to be unexpected. So thanks a lot.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. And I think it's also, just want to point out again that at the beginning of the call, Marie already put in the chat a Google Doc with lots of background information. I think we'll fill it up with stuff that came up in the course of the meeting, and all of the resources. And if there's anything particular that you still want us to add to that, you can also share it with us, and we will make sure to follow up with you. And the webinar has also been recorded, right, Marie? So it can be shared beyond this group. But thank you very much for coming and being here with us. Yeah, the Google Doc is in here, but we'll also send it to you after the end of the webinar with a recording in a little while, to make sure you can access all of the documents. And there's also, I want to point out that the Geoengineering Monitor website, also that is jointly hosted by a number of organizations, has a newsletter that you can sign up to if you want to stay engaged. And if you're interested in becoming part of a global coalition of organizations opposing geoengineering, you can join the Hands of Mother Earth Manifesto, sign up and become part of that effort. Thank you, and have a wonderful day, morning, afternoon, night, whatever, wherever you are.